I was 11 years old. It was late afternoon. My best friend Mamie and I had been in her room blasting Duran Duran. It was wretchedly hot out, a typical summer day in Mississippi. But Mamie's room inside the beige ranch was dark and cool, the shades drawn, the old brown air conditioner droning. We must have been outside at some point because I recall being thirsty in a way that I only was during my deep south 102-degree, 80% humidity childhood. Mamie ran out of the room a minute to get us some of her mama's iced tea that we always drank from mason jars. Waiting, I sat on the end of her bed, staring at the carpet. I can still remember the texture and color of that carpet, sculpted brown, pure 1970s. As I sat, I was jolted by the sudden opening of the sliding door to Mamie's closet, and with no warning, out walked her father, Darrell. He strode across the room, turned to me, muttered, "Hey, Jill," and walked on out. As his form receded down the hall, I could hear him hawking, clearing his sinuses in the incessant snorting way he always had. I was dumbfounded. When Mamie came back with our mason jars of tea, I said, "Mamie, your daddy just walked out of the closet." To which she replied, "Yeah, he's in there digging the extra room." She told this to me as a solid, unassailable fact that was as normal as the mason jars. So I looked in the closet, and sure enough, it was empty except for a square of the brown carpet attached to some plywood, standing next to a dimly lit hole in the floor. Darrell had been down there in that hole. Darrell had apparently dug that hole. Over the years, Darrell dug other holes, constructed other dreams. Once, after sleeping over, I awoke early to a tinny clinking sound. I got up and looked out the window, and there was Darrell, spade in hand, digging, though it was barely 6 a.m. on a Saturday. When I said, "Mamie, your daddy's out there digging in the backyard," her sleepy response was, "Yeah, he's working on the swimming pool." Again, this was told to me as an absolute fact. He was simply doing his work. And work he did. In old jeans and no shirt, the red baseball cap with the fish on it over his blonde mullet, Darrell dug this hole for weeks, day after sweltering day. It grew in size until finally it had a deep end and a shallow end. It was shaped like a pool, but ultimately it was just a dirt hole. Unable to fully realize its completion with the pouring of concrete, Darrell mysteriously acquired an enormous barrel, which he stuck into the deep end. He packed it around with dirt and filled it with the hose. And every day for the rest of that stifling summer, we'd put on our suits, get a running start, and slide through the mud, landing in that barrel. We were mermaids, dolphins, starfish. We made whirlpools, mud cakes, mud sculptures. I recall that the water was always vaguely warm, soupy, and brown. But to us, it was freedom from that heat. Those are some of my very best memories, and yet I know how bizarre they probably sound. To Mamie, these kinds of inscrutable circumstances defined her life. Her daddy constructed things, made the rules. He was the sun and the moon for his family. If he were sleeping, we had to tiptoe. When he yelled, the family had to snap to or face his wrath. Darrell's dubious activities were normal life to Mamie, and became so even to me, though it was always normal, peppered with a generous helping of mystery. Life at my house up the hill was different. My mother was a single parent, a hardworking school teacher. Mama and I lived in the same small house for my entire childhood, while Darrell dragged his family from pillar to post, from trailers to an old farmhouse, and even once to a camper in the woods with no electricity and a shower outside. Of course, I see things differently now. Darrell was shot 4 times in Vietnam and still suffers from PTSD. I knew this even as a little child. Mamie's granny would shake her head and say, "Darrell just ain't never been the same." But I couldn't get the full meaning of what he must have endured, having been drafted at the age of 17. And I still can't. What I did take away from watching Darrell was always from a child's perspective. I marveled at his behaviors as acts in their own right, his experiments breeding bloodthirsty Dobermans, The plans for a homemade tennis court, speaking of reclaimed wood, behind the trailer that, abandoned by the family, was now occupied by a mean old goat, and the makeshift remodeling of their farmhouse, which included boarded-up windows, these and countless others were pure enigmas. However, I saw even then that Darrell was still fighting battles. His family seemed to take this for granted, living where he put them. I'm not saying they never complained, but they went along, packing up belongings whenever he became restless. Their belongings had a special staying power: Darrell's purple hearts, Ida's ceramic figurines. The brown dishes made their way to the farmhouse, as did the brown patterned velveteen couches they'd had on Magnolia Street, and we still had tea in mason jars. But instead of the beige ranch, the setting was a plywood windowless room. I recall that the whole conglomeration was now covered in a layer of red clay dust from the dirt road outside and from Darrell's endless digging. As I grew, I ended up seeing aspects of the human search for identity through the lens of Darrell's existential battlegrounds. He was, and still is, a creator, a fighter beset by battles remembered and imagined, a most imperfect father figure. Not my father, true. My father was long gone. And as it turned out, Darrell was the most constant male influence in my young life. And somehow, I loved him and still love him for that. The memory of the ceaseless digging of his constant dreaming has stayed with me all these years and helped shape my art and my worldview. Thank you.